The barn door exploded inward with a crash that shattered the pre-dawn silence across the Henderson ranch, sending Martha's eyes snapping open in her loft bedroom as the thunderous sound of 15 horses pounding across frozen ground sent ice-cold recognition through every nerve in her body. She rolled from beneath the heavy wool blankets without hesitation, her bare feet hitting the planked wooden floor that creaked ominously in the bitter February cold as her hand instinctively reached beneath the straw-filled mattress for the leather-wrapped bundle that had remained hidden there for 23 years since her return from the Crow territory, where she had learned that survival meant becoming something infinitely more dangerous than the unforgiving Montana winter itself. The familiar weight of the throwing knife settled into her palm like a prayer answered by violent gods, and Martha's fingers traced the intricate beadwork on the leather handle that her adoptive Crow father Chief Gray Wolf had crafted during that brutal winter of 1864 when 8-year-old Martha Elizabeth Caldwell had ceased to exist and Morning Star Who Brings Death had been born in blood and necessity among the most feared warriors of the northern plains. Outside her frost-covered window the February wind howled across the endless expanse of snow-covered rangeland with the voice of a banshee, carrying with it the harsh laughter and crude curses of men who spoke in the universal language of violence and greed that she recognized from her darkest memories of war parties that had once terrorized white settlements across 3 territories. Martha's breath formed crystalline clouds in the frigid air as she pressed her face against the ice-rimmed glass, her trained eyes cataloging every detail of the 15 shadowy figures dismounting near the main corral where her prize breeding stock stood nervously pawing the snow-packed earth. Their leader was a massive man whose scarred face caught the pale moonlight filtering through the storm clouds that had been gathering strength since yesterday evening, and even at this distance Martha could see the deliberate way he positioned his men around the property perimeter with the tactical precision of someone who had orchestrated similar raids across the vast territories where law enforcement existed only in scattered settlements separated by hundreds of miles of wilderness. She knew without seeing their weapons or hearing their plans that these men had not ridden through a February blizzard simply to steal her 40 head of prime Morgan horses, the carefully selected bloodline she had spent the last 8 years building into the finest breeding stock between Billings and Great Falls, but had come to eliminate every living soul on the property who might later identify them to the territorial authorities who were already struggling to control the organized criminal gangs that had grown increasingly bold since the devastating winter of 1886–87 that had broken so many of the larger cattle operations and left the surviving ranches isolated and vulnerable to predators both human and animal. The sudden memory of Jake Morrison's scarred face from her single encounter with him outside the livestock auction in Billings 3 months earlier sent recognition shooting through her mind like chain lightning across a storm-darkened prairie sky, and Martha understood with the crystalline clarity that had kept her alive during 12 years among the Crow that this was no desperate raid by hungry men driven to crime by harsh circumstances, but rather a calculated military strike by the most feared and well-organized rustling gang operating between the Yellowstone and Missouri rivers under the leadership of a man whose reputation for brutality extended from the Canadian border to the Colorado Territory. Morrison had approached her on that crisp November afternoon when she had been examining a prize stallion for possible purchase, his pale gray eyes studying her with the cold predatory assessment of a timber wolf evaluating potential prey while he asked seemingly casual questions about her ranch's exact location, the number of hands she employed, and her husband's business travel schedule that kept him away from the property for weeks at a time. Martha had deflected his inquiries with the careful politeness that frontier women learned when dealing with dangerous men, but every instinct honed during her years among warriors who survived by reading the subtle signals that preceded violence had screamed warnings that she filed away in the part of her mind where survival skills lived like coiled serpents waiting to strike. Martha's hands moved with the practiced silence of a predator as she retrieved the sacred buckskin bundle from its hiding place beneath the loose floorboards near the chimney, unwrapping the collection of blades that represented not merely weapons but the physical manifestation of the deadliest fighting skills she had mastered during those 12 transformative years when her very survival depended on her ability to kill efficiently with implements that produced no sound to alert distant enemies or attract the attention of rival war parties who might be tracking the same prey across the endless grasslands. The largest blade was a modified Bowie knife that Gray Wolf had personally crafted with a slightly curved design that made it devastatingly effective for both the slashing cuts that opened major arteries and the precise thrusting techniques that could penetrate between ribs to find a human heart with surgical accuracy. Arranged beside the Bowie knife were 6 smaller throwing blades, each one perfectly balanced according to specifications that Gray Wolf had learned from his grandfather who had fought against rival tribes long before white settlers had appeared on the plains, and Martha tested their familiar weight as muscle memory flooded back with the intensity of a flash flood roaring down a mountain canyon. These were not the crude implements that desperate men fashioned from scrap metal, but rather precision instruments created by master craftsmen who understood that a warrior's life might depend on the ability to place a blade through a target no larger than a silver dollar at distances that would astonish men who had never witnessed the training methods employed by the most elite fighters of the Plains tribes. The sound of splintering wood echoing up from the main floor told Martha that Morrison's men were systematically breaking into her home, and she could distinguish individual voices as they called out orders and responses while conducting their search with the methodical thoroughness of men who had performed similar operations many times before across the scattered homesteads and isolated ranches that dotted the Montana Territory like islands of civilization in an ocean of wilderness where the nearest neighbor might be 50 miles away and the closest law enforcement officer could be weeks of hard travel distant even under the best weather conditions. Through the gaps between the rough-hewn floorboards she could see Morrison himself standing near her stone fireplace, his enormous frame silhouetted against the dying red embers that still glowed from the evening's fire as he gestured with gloved hands while issuing commands to his followers in the harsh whisper that seasoned criminals used when they wanted to avoid alerting their intended victims until the moment came to strike with overwhelming force. Two of his men were already moving toward the rear of the house where old Samuel Morrison and his son Peter slept in the small log cabin that served as the bunkhouse, and Martha knew that within minutes those two faithful men who had worked her land loyally for 6 years would be dead unless she acted with the swift precision that her Crow training had burned into her muscle memory like brands seared into the flesh of range cattle. Martha tested the weight and balance of her first throwing knife, feeling the familiar sensation that had saved her life more times than she could accurately count during the brutal winter raids when Crow war parties struck enemy camps under conditions so harsh that only the strongest and most skillful warriors survived to see spring return to the high plains where survival itself was a daily battle against elements that killed the weak without mercy or hesitation. The blade seemed to hum with deadly potential in her grip as she adjusted her fingers to the exact position that Grey Wolf had taught her during countless hours of practice, thumb and forefinger controlling the precise release point while her entire body became a finely tuned mechanism designed for delivering death with surgical accuracy across distances that would surprise and terrify men who had never faced an opponent trained in the fighting methods of the most feared warriors on the northern frontier. The critical moment arrived when Morrison stepped directly beneath her hiding place in the loft, his attention completely focused on directing two of his subordinates toward the narrow staircase that led to her bedroom. And Martha understood that her window of opportunity was measured in heartbeats rather than minutes because once the search reached the upper floor her advantage of surprise would be lost forever and she would face 15 armed men in open combat where even her superior skills might not be sufficient to prevent the massacre that Morrison clearly intended to perpetrate before stealing her horses and disappearing into the storm that was building toward blizzard intensity outside the walls of her home. She had learned during her formative years among the Crow that successful warfare depended entirely on striking when and where the enemy least expected attack, using speed and precision to eliminate multiple threats before they could organize an effective response or bring their superior numbers to bear against a lone defender, and now she prepared to put those hard-earned lessons into practice against men who had made the potentially fatal error of underestimating the woman they intended to rob and murder simply because she appeared to be a defenseless ranch wife isolated in the middle of nowhere with no protection except two elderly hired hands who would pose no serious threat to experienced killers. Below her the Rustlers continued their methodical room-by-room search of the main floor, completely unaware that they were being stalked by someone whose survival skills had been forged in the white-hot crucible of the most unforgiving warfare the American frontier had ever witnessed. Conflicts where mercy was a luxury that no warrior could afford and hesitation meant death not only for the fighter but for everyone they had sworn to protect. Martha felt the familiar supernatural calm settling over her mind like morning mist on a mountain lake as she prepared to undergo the transformation from seemingly helpless ranch woman into the lethal predator that 12 years of intensive Crow training had created, a metamorphosis as complete and irreversible as a butterfly emerging from its chrysalis to spread wings that could carry it to heights unimaginable during its earthbound existence. The storm outside was building toward the kind of paralyzing blizzard that could trap men for days in hostile territory where exposure meant certain death and the nearest shelter might be impossible to reach even for experienced plainsmen who knew how to navigate by stars that would be invisible behind the wall of wind-driven snow. But Martha intended to ensure that Jake Morrison and every member of his murderous gang would never leave the Henderson Ranch alive to continue terrorizing other isolated families scattered across the windswept vastness of Montana Territory where winter was always the ultimate arbiter of who lived and who died on the unforgiving frontier that demanded everything from those who dared to call it home. Martha's first knife found its mark with the whispered song of perfectly balanced steel cutting through frigid air, the blade burying itself to the hilt in Morrison's neck just below his left ear as he turned to bark another order at his men, and the massive Rustler's eyes widened in shocked disbelief for a single frozen moment before his knees buckled and he crashed to the floor like a felled oak tree while blood spread across the rough wooden planks in an expanding crimson pool that reflected the dying firelight like some terrible mirror designed by the devil himself. The silence that followed lasted exactly 3 heartbeats before pandemonium erupted throughout the house as Morrison's men realized their seemingly invincible leader was dead and began shouting contradictory orders while frantically searching for an enemy they could not see, their voices rising to near panic as they understood that death had struck from an impossible angle with surgical precision that spoke of training far beyond anything they had encountered in their years of terrorizing defenseless settlers across the lawless territories. Moving with the fluid grace of a hunting cat stalking prey through tall grass, Martha dropped through the loft opening like a falling shadow made manifest, landing silently on the balls of her bare feet behind the 2 rustlers who were standing over Morrison's corpse while arguing in harsh whispers about whether to flee immediately into the howling storm or continue the search for whoever had killed their leader with such devastating efficiency that it challenged their fundamental understanding of how frontier violence was supposed to unfold. Her second knife took the bearded man through the base of his skull before he could turn around, the blade severing his spinal cord so cleanly that he died without uttering a sound except for the soft exhalation of breath leaving his lungs for the final time, while her third throw caught his companion in the throat as he spun toward the sound of his partner's body hitting the floor, the steel point punching through cartilage and windpipe to emerge from the back of his neck in a spray of arterial blood that painted the wall behind him like some macabre artist's canvas created in a medium of death and terror. The remaining 12 rustlers were now spread throughout the house and the immediate vicinity of the ranch buildings like seeds scattered by a violent wind, their earlier confidence completely shattered by the sudden realization that they were facing an opponent whose skills exceeded anything in their collective experience of frontier violence, where most conflicts were settled by superior firepower rather than the kind of intimate, personal killing that required getting close enough to look into a victim's eyes as life departed from their mortal shell. Martha could hear them calling out to each other in voices that carried the sharp edge of fear as they tried to determine how many defenders they faced and where the next attack might come from, their coordination dissolving into the chaos that always accompanied the sudden reversal of fortune that transformed hunters into the hunted in the space between one heartbeat and the next. She retrieved her throwing knives with the practiced efficiency of a warrior who understood that weapons were sacred tools that must be maintained and preserved through every stage of battle, wiping the blood clean on Morrison's heavy wool coat before returning them to their designated positions in the buckskin bundle with movements so economical and precise that they seemed choreographed by some ancient god of war who had spent eternity perfecting the dance of death. Martha's hands showed no tremor despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins like liquid fire, because Grey Wolf had taught her that emotional control was the foundation upon which all other fighting skills were built. And a warrior who allowed fear or excitement to compromise their precision was a warrior who would not survive to see another sunrise over the endless grasslands where life and death were decided by margins measured in fractions of inches and split seconds. The sound of breaking glass from the kitchen told her that at least 3 of the rustlers had circled around to the rear of the house, probably intending to trap her between 2 groups while the others maintained their positions near the front entrance where Morrison's body served as a grim reminder that overconfidence was a luxury that could cost a man his life faster than a rattlesnake strike. But Martha had learned during her formative years with the Crow that successful warriors never allowed enemies to dictate the terms of engagement when superior knowledge of terrain could be used to offset numerical disadvantage. And she possessed the kind of intimate familiarity with every inch of her property that came from 8 years of daily work maintaining the buildings and fences that kept her livestock safe from both predators and the harsh weather that ruled the Montana Territory with an iron fist wrapped in a blizzard's fury. Martha moved through her own home like a ghost intimately familiar with every creaking board and hidden passage, utilizing the knowledge that came from countless nights of walking these rooms in darkness to check on sick animals or investigate strange sounds that might indicate trouble brewing in the vast wilderness that surrounded her isolated ranch like an ocean of grass and stone where the nearest neighbor was 50 miles away and might as well have been on the moon for all the help they could provide during moments of crisis. Her opponent stumbled through unfamiliar territory where every shadow might conceal death waiting to strike with silent efficiency, their heavy boots announcing their positions with each step while Martha's bare feet made no sound as she flowed through the darkness like water finding the path of least resistance down a mountainside. The psychological advantage she possessed was almost as important as her physical skills, because Morrison's surviving men had expected to face either helpless victims who would beg for mercy that would never come, or at most a desperate homesteader with a rifle who might account for one or two attackers before being overwhelmed by superior numbers and firepower. Instead, they found themselves locked in mortal combat with someone whose methods of killing were utterly foreign to their experience, an opponent who struck without warning from impossible angles and disappeared back into the darkness before they could mount any effective response, leaving behind only corpses and the growing certainty that they had made a terrible mistake in choosing the Henderson Ranch as their target for what was supposed to have been a routine robbery that would net them 40 prime horses and eliminate the witnesses with minimal risk or effort. Martha's intimate familiarity with every corner of her property became her greatest weapon as she led the surviving rustlers into a deadly game of cat and mouse that stretched from the main house through the network of outbuildings that comprised the working heart of the Henderson Ranch, each structure offering opportunities for ambush and concealment that she had unconsciously catalogued during years of daily ranch work without ever imagining that such knowledge would someday mean the difference between life and death in a battle where quarter was neither asked nor given. The storm outside had intensified to true blizzard conditions, with howling wind driving snow horizontally across the open ground and reducing visibility to mere yards, conditions that would have been a disaster for most people but represented a significant tactical advantage for someone who had been trained in the Crow methods of winter warfare, where weather itself became an ally in the struggle for survival against enemies who lacked the specialized knowledge necessary to function effectively. When nature turned hostile, she struck next in the massive barn where 4 of the rustlers had taken shelter while trying to organize a coordinated search pattern that might allow them to corner their mysterious opponent and bring their superior numbers to bear in a conventional firefight where marksmanship and ammunition capacity would determine the outcome rather than the kind of intimate blade work that had already claimed 3 of their companions. Martha used her detailed knowledge of the building's construction to climb into the hayloft through an exterior ladder that remained completely invisible to men whose attention was focused on watching the main entrances below, their rifles trained on doorways through which they expected death to approach in forms they could understand and counter with conventional tactics learned during years of frontier violence. Martha's 4th kill came as she dropped silently from the overhead beams like a hunting spider descending on prey caught in its web, landing directly on top of an unsuspecting rustler who had positioned himself strategically near the horse stalls where he could command a clear field of fire across most of the barn's interior while remaining partially concealed behind wooden posts that provided some protection from return fire. Her Bowie knife slid between his ribs with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel, the curved blade angled upward to pierce his heart while her free hand covered his mouth to prevent any sound that might alert his 3 companions to her presence in their midst, and she lowered his body silently to the straw-covered floor with the gentle care of a mother putting a child to bed before moving like a wraith toward her next target, who remained completely unaware that death had joined their desperate council of war. The psychological warfare was proving to be as devastating as the physical killing, because the surviving rustlers could hear their companions dying one by one without ever seeing their killer or understanding how she moved through their midst like an avenging spirit born from the howling storm that raged outside the fragile circles of lamplight where they huddled in growing terror while their numbers steadily diminished. Martha had learned from Grey Wolf that fear was often more effective than steel in defeating enemies, because frightened men made mistakes that skilled warriors could exploit, and she could hear the panic creeping into the voices of Morrison's followers as they called out increasingly desperate questions to companions who would never answer again because they had already crossed the threshold that separated the living from the dead in the brutal democracy that ruled the frontier, where weakness meant extinction and only the strong survived to see another dawn break over the endless expanse of grassland that stretched to every horizon. Her 5th victim died while standing guard at the barn's rear entrance, assigned to watch for any attempt to escape through the back while his companions searched the main interior for signs of their invisible enemy, but his attention was focused outward toward the storm-lashed landscape rather than the hayloft above, where Martha had positioned herself with the infinite patience of a mountain lion waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The throwing knife took him through the right eye socket with such tremendous force that the steel point emerged from the back of his skull and lodged deep in the wooden door frame behind him, creating a gruesome tableau that his surviving companions would eventually discover when they finally worked up enough courage to investigate why he had stopped responding to their increasingly frantic calls and demands for situation reports. Martha was already moving toward the granary where she had observed 2 more rustlers taking defensive positions during her initial reconnaissance of the enemy's deployment across her property, her bare feet silent on the snow-covered ground despite the bitter cold that would have incapacitated most people within minutes of exposure to the sub-zero temperatures that turned human breath into crystalline clouds and made metal so cold that touching it with bare skin would leave permanent marks. But her years among the Crow had taught her techniques for maintaining body heat and circulation that allowed her to function effectively even under conditions that routinely defeated men who relied entirely on heavy clothing and artificial shelter for protection against the brutal elements that characterized Montana winters when the temperature could drop 40 degrees below zero and stay there for weeks at a time. The granary provided what military tacticians would have called an ideal killing ground because its single entrance could be watched and controlled, while the narrow spaces between towering stacks of stored grain sacks created a maze-like interior that allowed an attacker to approach targets from multiple directions without being detected by enemies whose attention was necessarily divided between watching for threats and trying to maintain some semblance of coordinated defense. Martha's 6th and 7th kills came within seconds of each other as she struck from opposite directions with the fluid efficiency of a dancer performing steps rehearsed through years of dedicated practice, eliminating both rustlers before either could cry out a warning to their remaining companions or discharge their weapons in a final desperate attempt to inflict some damage on the opponent who was systematically dismantling Morrison's gang with methodical precision. The first man died with her smaller utility knife between his shoulder blades, the blade angled upward with surgical precision to pierce his heart from behind while he crouched behind a grain sack trying to peer through a gap in the wall where a missing board provided a view of the approach to the main house, and he never knew that death had found him until consciousness faded into the eternal darkness that awaited all men regardless of their intentions or the violence they had inflicted on others during their brief passage through the world of the living. His companion managed to turn toward the sound of his partner's body hitting the floor, but his movement brought him directly into the path of Martha's Bowie knife as its curved edge opened his throat in a single fluid motion that sent arterial blood spraying across stored grain sacks while he collapsed beside his friend in the spreading pool of crimson that marked another small victory in the larger war between civilization and chaos that raged constantly along the frontier where law existed only at the end of a gun barrel, and justice was dispensed by whoever possessed the skill and will to impose it on those who preyed upon the innocent. By this point in the night's grim work, the surviving 5 rustlers had completely abandoned any pretense of conducting an organized search operation and had barricaded themselves in the sturdy log bunkhouse where old Samuel Morrison and his adult son Peter lay dead with their throats cut in the efficient and brutal manner that had become Morrison's gang's trademark signature across 3 territories where they had terrorized isolated families and small settlements for more than 2 years. Martha felt no grief for the faithful ranch hands who had worked her land with dedication and loyalty, not because she lacked human compassion but because grief was a luxury that warriors could not afford during combat when the slightest emotional distraction might mean the difference between victory and death, and she had learned to compartmentalize such feelings until the battle was won and there would be time for mourning those who had fallen. Instead of sorrow, Martha felt only the cold calculation that Grey Wolf had taught her to embrace during moments of mortal crisis, the mental state where every decision was measured against a single criterion of tactical effectiveness without regard for sentiment or mercy that might compromise her ability to survive against superior numbers and firepower. The 5 remaining rustlers represented a significant threat despite their demoralized condition, because cornered men often fought with the desperate ferocity of wounded animals who understood that death was stalking them through the darkness, and their combined firepower was still sufficient to kill her if they managed to coordinate their efforts or if she made a tactical error that exposed her to their concentrated fire during the final phase of what had become a war of extermination where only one side would survive to see the sunrise that was still hours away. The bunkhouse presented her greatest tactical challenge of the entire engagement because the remaining rustlers had established clear fields of fire covering all conventional approaches to the building, and they were now fully aware that they faced a single opponent whose skills far exceeded their ability to counter using traditional methods of frontier combat where superior numbers and heavier weapons usually determined the outcome of violent confrontations. Martha studied the situation from concealment behind the blacksmith shop, using her intimate knowledge of local wind patterns and snow drift formations to plan an approach route that would bring her within striking distance without exposing her to the rifle fire that would inevitably erupt once her position was discovered by men who had nothing left to lose except their lives and were prepared to sell those lives as dearly as possible in the hope of taking their tormentor with them into whatever afterlife awaited killers and their victims. The storm itself would provide cover for her final assault, and Martha timed her movement to coincide with the fierce wind gusts that drove curtains of snow across the open ground between her position and the bunkhouse where Morrison's remaining followers waited with the desperate courage of men who knew they were trapped by an opponent they could not see, hear, or predict with any degree of accuracy. Her planned route would take her through terrain that no rational person would have attempted to cross in daylight under perfect weather conditions, much less during a blizzard that had reduced visibility to less than arm's length and created drifts deep enough to swallow a horse and rider without leaving any trace of their passage except for a slight depression in the snow that would be filled and smoothed by morning winds. But Martha's years of intensive winter training among the Crow had taught her to navigate by senses other than sight when circumstances demanded movement through hostile territory under conditions that would have defeated warriors from tribes that lived in more temperate climates where survival did not depend on mastering techniques that seemed impossible to anyone who had not spent years learning to read the subtle signs that indicated direction, distance, and danger even when the world had been transformed into a white void where up and down became meaningless concepts and death waited for anyone foolish enough to venture more than a few steps from shelter without possessing the specialized knowledge that separated those who lived through Montana winters from those who became frozen corpses that would not be discovered until the spring thaw revealed their remains to scavengers and the occasional traveler. The first indication the cornered rustlers had of Martha's presence came when her throwing knife shattered the single window that provided their only source of light inside the bunkhouse, the impact extinguishing the oil lamp in a shower of glass fragments and burning kerosene that plunged the interior into absolute darkness while simultaneously announcing that their invisible enemy had found them despite their careful defensive preparations. The sudden transition from dim illumination to complete blackness leveled the tactical playing field by removing their advantage of superior numbers and concentrated firepower while giving Martha the opportunity to employ fighting techniques that were most effective when enemies could not see the death that was approaching them through the blackness like some primordial nightmare given physical form. The panicked gunfire that erupted immediately after the lamp died served only to reveal the approximate positions of the 5 remaining rustlers without hitting a target that moved through the confined space like liquid mercury flowing through cracks too small to accommodate any solid form, and Martha used the muzzle flashes to map the interior layout of a building she had visited countless times during daylight hours but had never before navigated in complete darkness while dodging bullets fired by men whose terror had overcome their tactical training. She slipped through the shattered window opening like smoke flowing through a crack in a stone wall, her entry so silent that none of the surviving gang members realized that death had joined them in their improvised fortress until it was far too late to mount any effective defense against an opponent who possessed every possible advantage except numbers. Martha's 8th kill came as she materialized beside the rustler who had been positioned nearest to the former light source, her Bowie knife finding his throat with the precision of long practice while his attention remained focused on trying to reload his rifle in darkness so complete that he could not see his own hands, much less the weapon he was attempting to service. His death gurgle was lost in the continuing gunfire as his panicked companions continued to shoot wildly into the darkness while trying to hit an enemy whose exact location remained a deadly mystery that would not be solved before they joined their leader and the rest of Morrison's gang in whatever afterlife awaited men who had spent their adult lives spreading terror and death across the frontier where might made right and the strong took whatever they wanted from the weak until they encountered someone stronger and more ruthless than themselves. Her 9th victim died while attempting to crawl toward what he hoped was the rear exit of the bunkhouse, seeking escape from the nightmare that had transformed their simple robbery into a slaughter that exceeded anything in his experience of frontier violence, but Martha's blade found him before he had covered half the distance to the door that represented his only hope of survival. The steel slid up under his ribcage to pierce his heart while her free hand prevented him from crying out a warning that might have given his 3 surviving companions some small tactical advantage in the deadly game of blind man's bluff that was now being played with knives and bullets in the confines of a log cabin that had become a tomb for men who had ridden onto the Henderson ranch with dreams of easy wealth and found instead the kind of violent death they had inflicted on others during their careers as predators who had terrorized the scattered settlements of Montana Territory. The 10th rustler managed to flee through the rear door into the howling embrace of the storm, his terror overcoming whatever survival instincts might have warned him that running blindly into a Montana blizzard was merely choosing a different and potentially slower form of death than remaining to face the knife-wielding demon who had systematically butchered his companions with skills that seemed to transcend normal human limitations. His escape lasted only long enough for him to realize that the storm outside was every bit as deadly as the opponent he was fleeing, and Martha's throwing knife found him before he had covered 20 yards from the bunkhouse, the perfectly balanced blade taking him between the shoulder blades to sever his spinal cord and drop him face-first into a snowdrift that would cover his body completely before morning came to reveal the full extent of the carnage that had transformed the Henderson ranch into a battlefield where 15 confident men had discovered too late that they had chosen the wrong victim for their final crime.